You've got time and numbers on your side, and you'll be making decisions long after politicians like me have left the scene. And I can promise you this, the world will be watching what decisions you make. The world will be watching what you do. Because one of the wonderful things that's happening is where people used to only see suffering and conflict in Africa, suddenly now they're seeing opportunity for resources, for investment, for partnership, for influence. Governments and businesses from around the world are sizing up the continent, and they're making decisions themselves about where to invest their own time and their own energy. And as I said yesterday at a town hall meeting up in Johannesburg, that's a good thing. We want all countries, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, Europe, America, we want everybody paying attention to what's going on here because it speaks to your progress. And I've traveled to Africa on this trip because my bet is on the young people who are the heartbeat of Africa's story. I'm betting on all of you. As President of the United States, I believe that my own nation will benefit enormously if you reach your full potential. If prosperity is broadly shared here in Africa, that middle class will be an enormous market for our goods. If strong democracies take root, that will enable our people and businesses to draw closer to yours. If peace prevails over war, we will all be more secure. And if the dignity of the individual is upheld across Africa, then I believe Americans will be more free as well, because I believe that none of us are fully free when others in the human family remain shackled by poverty or disease or oppression. Now, America's been involved in Africa for decades, but we are moving beyond the simple provision of assistance, foreign aid, to a new model of partnership between America and Africa, a partnership of equals that focuses on your capacity to solve problems and your capacity to grow. Our efforts focus on three areas that shape our lives: opportunity, democracy, and peace. So first off, we want a partnership that empowers Africans to access greater opportunity in their own lives, in their communities, and for their countries. As the largest economy on the continent, South Africa is part of a trend that extends from south to north, east to west. More and more African economies are poised to take off. And increased trade and investment from the United States has the potential to accelerate these trends, creating new jobs and opportunities on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm calling for America to up our game when it comes to Africa. We're bringing together business leaders from America and Africa to deepen our engagement. We're going to launch new trade missions and promote investment from companies back home. We'll launch an effort in Addis to renew the African Growth and Opportunity Act to break down barriers to trade. And tomorrow I'll discuss a new Trade Africa initiative to expand our ties across the continent. Because we want to unleash the power of entrepreneurship and markets to create opportunity here in Africa. It was interesting. Yesterday at the town hall meeting I had was with a number of young people. First three questions had to do with trade. Because there was a recognition. These young people said, I want to start something. I want to build something. And then I want to sell something. Now, to succeed, these efforts have to connect to something bigger. And for America, this isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet or the resources that can be taken out of the ground. We believe that societies and economies only advance as far as individuals are free to carry them forward. And just as freedom cannot exist when people are imprisoned for their political views, true opportunity cannot exist when people are imprisoned by sickness or hunger or darkness. And so the question we've been asking ourselves is, what will it take to empower individual Africans? For one thing, we believe that countries have to have the power to feed themselves. So instead of shipping food to Africa, we're now helping millions of small farmers in Africa make use of new technologies and farm more land. And through a new alliance of governments and the private sector, we're investing billions of dollars in agriculture that grows more crops, brings more food to market, gives farmers better prices, and helps lift 50 million people out of poverty in a decade. An end to famine, a thriving African agricultural industry. That's what opportunity looks like. That's what we want to build with you. We believe that countries have to have the power to prevent illness and care for the sick. And our efforts to combat malaria and tropical illness can lead to an achievable goal: ending child and maternal deaths from preventable disease. Already our commitment to fight HIV/AIDS has saved millions and allows us to imagine what was once unthinkable: an AIDS-free generation. And while America will continue to provide billions of dollars in support, we can't make progress without African partners. So I'm proud that by the end of my presidency, South Africa has determined it will be the first African country to fully manage its HIV care and treatment program. That's an enormous achievement. Well, healthy mothers, healthy children, strong public health systems, that's what opportunity looks like. And we believe that nations must have the power to connect their people to the promise of the 21st century. Access to electricity is fundamental to opportunity in this age. It's the light that children study by, the energy that allows an idea to be transformed into a real business. It's the lifeline for families to meet their most basic needs. And it's the connection that's needed to plug Africa into the grid of the global economy. You've got to have power. And yet 2/3 of the population in sub-Saharan Africa lacks access to power. And the percentage is much higher for those who don't live in the cities. So today I'm proud to announce a new initiative. We've been dealing with agriculture, we've been dealing with health. Now we're going to talk about power. Power Africa, a new initiative that will double access to power in sub-Saharan Africa. Double it. We're going to start by investing $7 billion in U.S. government resources. We're going to partner with the private sector, who themselves have committed more than $9 billion in investment. And in partnership with African nations, we're going to develop new sources of energy. We'll reach more households, not just in cities, but in villages and on farms. We'll expand access for those who live currently off the power grid. And we'll support clean energy to protect our planet and combat climate change. So, a light where currently there's darkness. The energy needed to lift people out of poverty. That's what opportunity looks like. So this is America's vision: a partnership with Africa that unleashes growth and the potential of every citizen, not just a few at the very top. And this is achievable. There's nothing that I've outlined that cannot happen. But history tells us that true progress is only possible where governments exist to serve their people and not the other way around. If anyone wants to see the difference between freedom and tyranny, let them come here to South Africa. Here, citizens brave bullets and beatings to claim that most basic right, the ability to be free, to determine your own fate in your own land. And Madiba's example extended far beyond that victory. Now, I mentioned yesterday at the town hall, like America's first president, George Washington, he understood that democracy can only endure when it's bigger than just one person. So his willingness to leave power was as profound as his ability to claim power. The good news is that this example is getting attention across the continent. We see it in free and fair elections from Ghana to Zambia. We hear it in the voices of civil society. I was in Senegal and met with some civil society groups, including a group called Yen Mare, which meant fed up, that helped to defend the will of the people after elections in Senegal. We recognize it in places like Tanzania, where text messages connect citizens to their representatives. And we strengthen it when organizations stand up for democratic principles, like ECOWAS did in Côte d'Ivoire. But this work is not complete. We all know that. Not in those countries where leaders enrich themselves with impunity. Not in communities where you can't start a business or go to school or get a house without paying a bribe to somebody. These things have to change. And they have to change not just because such corruption is immoral, but it's also a matter of self-interest and economics. Governments that respect the rights of their citizens and abide by the rule of law do better, grow faster, draw more investment than those who don't. That's just a fact. Just look at your neighbor, Zimbabwe, where the promise of liberation gave way to the corruption of power, and then the collapse of the economy. Now, after the leaders of this region, led by South Africa, brokered an end to what has been a long-running crisis, Zimbabweans have a new constitution. The economy is beginning to recover. So there's an opportunity to move forward. But only if there is an election that is free and fair and peaceful, so that Zimbabweans can determine their future without fear of intimidation and retribution. And after elections, there must be respect for the universal rights upon which democracy depends. These are things that America stands for. Not perfectly, but that's what we stand for. That's what my administration stands for. We don't tell people who their leaders should be, but we do stand up with those who support the principles that lead to a better life. And that's why we're interested in investing not in strong men, but in strong institutions. Independent judiciaries that can enforce the rule of law. Honest police forces that can protect the people's interests instead of their own. An open government that can bring transparency and accountability. And yes, that's why we stand up for civil society, for journalists and NGOs and community organizers and activists who give people a voice. That's why we support societies that empower women, because no country will reach its potential unless it draws on the talents of our wives and our mothers and our sisters and our daughters. Just to editorialize here for a second, because my father's home country of Kenya, like much of Africa, you see women doing work and not getting respect. And I tell you, you can measure how well a country does by how it treats its women. And all across this continent and all around the world, we got more work to do on that front. So you got some sisters saying amen. Now, I know that there are some in Africa who hear me say these things, who see America's support for these values, and say, that's intrusive. Why are you meddling? I know there are those who argue that ideas like democracy and transparency are somehow Western exports. I disagree. Those in power who make those arguments are usually trying to distract people from their own abuses. Sometimes they're the same people who, behind closed doors, are willing to sell off their own country's resources to foreign interests just so long as they get a cut. Just telling the truth. Now, ultimately, I believe that Africans should make up their own minds about what serves African interests. We trust your judgment, the judgment of ordinary people. We believe that when you control your destiny, if you've got a handle on your governments, then governments will promote freedom and opportunity, because that'll serve you. And it shouldn't just be America that stands up for democracy. It should be Africans as well. So here in South Africa, your democratic story has inspired the world. And through the power of your example, and through your position in organizations like SADC and the African Union, you can be a voice for the human progress that you've written into your own Constitution. You shouldn't assume that that's unique to South Africa. People have aspirations like that everywhere. And this brings me to the final area where our partnership can empower people: the pursuit and protection of peace in Africa. So long as parts of Africa continue to be ravaged by war and mayhem, opportunity and democracy cannot take root. Across the continent, there are places where too often fear prevails. From Mali to Mogadishu, senseless terrorism all too often perverts the meaning of Islam, one of the world's great religions, and takes the lives of countless innocent Africans. From Congo to Sudan, conflicts fester, robbing men and women and children of the lives that they deserve. In too many countries, the actions of thugs and warlords and drug cartels and human traffickers hold back the promise of Africa, enslaving others for their own purposes. Now, America cannot put a stop to these tragedies alone, and you don't expect us to. That's a job for Africans. But we can help, and we will help. I know there's a lot of talk of America's military presence in Africa, but if you look at what we're actually doing, time and again, we're putting muscle behind African efforts. That's what we're doing in the Sahel, where the nations of West Africa have stepped forward to keep the peace as Mali now begins to rebuild. That's what we're doing in Central Africa, where a coalition of countries is closing the space where the Lord's Resistance Army can operate. That's what we're doing in Somalia, where an African Union force, AMISOM, is helping a new government to stand on its own 2 feet. These efforts have to lead to lasting peace, not just words on a paper or promises that fade away. Peace between and within Sudan and South Sudan, so that these governments get on with the work of investing in their deeply impoverished peoples. Peace in the Congo, with nations keeping their commitments so rights are at last claimed by the people of this war-torn country, and women and children no longer live in fear. Absolutely. Peace in Mali, where people will make their voices heard in new elections this summer. In each of these cases, Africa must lead, and America will help. And America will make no apology for supporting African efforts to end conflict and stand up for human dignity. Now, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the OAU, now the African Union, an occasion that is more historic because the AU is taking on these challenges. And I want America to take our engagement, not just on security issues, but on environmental issues and economic issues and social issues, educational issues. I want to take that engagement to a whole new level. So I'm proud to announce that next year I'm going to invite heads of state from across sub-Saharan Africa to a summit in the United States to help launch a new chapter in U.S.-African relations. And as I mentioned yesterday, I'm also going to hold a summit with the next class of our Young African Leaders Initiative, because we want to engage the leaders and tomorrow's leaders in figuring out how we can best work together. So let me close by saying this. Governments matter. Political leadership matters. And I do hope that some of you here today decide to follow the path of public service. It can sometimes be thankless, but I believe it can also be a noble life. But we also have to recognize that the choices we make are not limited to the policies and programs of government. Peace and prosperity in Africa and around the world also depends on the attitudes of people. Too often, the source of tragedy, the source of conflict, involves the choices ordinary people make that divide us from one another. Black from white, Christian from Muslim, tribe from tribe. Africa contains a multitude of identities. But the nations and people of Africa will not fulfill their promise so long as some use these identities to justify subjugation.
News that moves. eNCA.com.